a wretched, suffering creature, whose state of mind was gloomy and miserable, but most comprehensible. In the morning Rogojin had seemed to be trying to keep out of the way, but at the station this afternoon he had stood out. He had concealed himself, indeed, less than the prince himself. At the house now he had stood 50 yards off on the other side of the road, with folded hands, watching, plainly in view, and apparently desirous of being seen. He had stood there like an accuser, like a judge, not like a what? And why had not the prince approached him and spoken to him, instead of turning away and pretending he had seen nothing, although their eyes met? Yes, their eyes had met, and they had looked at each other. Why, he had himself wished to take Rogojin by the hand and go in together. He had himself determined to go to him on the morrow and to tell him that he had seen her. He had repudiated the demon as he walked to the house, and his heart had been full of joy. Was there something in the whole aspect of the man today sufficient to justify the prince's terror and the awful suspicions of his demon? Something seen but indescribable, which filled him with dreadful presentiments. Yes, he was convinced of it. Convinced of what? Oh, how mean and hideous of him to feel this conviction, this presentiment! How he blamed himself for it! Speak, if you dare, and tell me, what is the presentiment? He repeated to himself over and over again. Put it into words, speak out clearly and distinctly. Oh, miserable coward that I am! The prince flushed with shame for his own baseness. How shall I ever look this man in the face again? My God, what a day! And what a nightmare! What a nightmare! There was a moment during this long, wretched walk back from the Petersburg side when the prince felt an irresistible desire to go straight to Rogojin's, wait for him, embrace him with tears of shame and contrition, and tell him of his distrust, and finish with it, once for all. But here he was back at his hotel. How often during the day he had thought of this hotel with loathing, its corridor, its rooms, its stairs. How he had dreaded coming back to it for some reason. What a regular old woman I am today, he had said to himself each time, with annoyance. I believe in every foolish presentiment that comes into my head. He stopped for a moment at the door. A great flush of shame came over him. I am a coward, a wretched coward, he said, and moved forward again. But once more he paused. Among all the incidents of the day, one recurred to his mind to the exclusion of the rest, although now that his self-control was regained, and he was no longer under the influence of a nightmare, he was able to think of it calmly. It concerned the knife on Rogojin's table. Why should not Rogojin have as many knives on his table as he chooses? Thought the prince, wondering at his suspicions, as he had done when he found himself looking into the cutler's window. What could it have to do with me? He said to himself again, and stopped as if rooted to the ground by a kind of paralysis of limb, such as attacks people under the stress of some humiliating recollection. The doorway was dark and gloomy at any time, but just at this moment it was rendered doubly so by the fact that the thunderstorm had just broken, and the rain was coming down in torrents. And in the semi-darkness the prince distinguished a man standing close to the stairs, apparently waiting. There was nothing particularly significant in the fact that a man was standing back in the doorway, waiting to come out or go upstairs, but the prince felt an irresistible conviction that he knew this man, and that it was Rogojin. The man moved on up the stairs. A moment later the prince passed up them too. His heart froze within him. In a minute or two I shall know all, he thought. The staircase led to the first and second corridors of the hotel, along which lay the guests' bedrooms. As is often the case in Petersburg houses, it was narrow and very dark, and turned around a massive stone column. On the first landing, which was as small as the necessary turn of the stairs allowed, there was a niche in the column, about half a yard wide, and in this niche the prince felt convinced that a man stood concealed. He thought he could distinguish a figure standing there. He would pass by quickly and not look. He took a step forward, but could bear the uncertainty no longer and turned his head. The eyes, the same two eyes, met his. The man concealed in the niche had also taken a step forward. For 1 second they stood face to face. Suddenly the prince caught the man by the shoulder and twisted him round towards the light, so that he might see his face more clearly. Rogojin's eyes flashed, and a smile of insanity distorted his countenance. His right hand was raised, and something glittered in it. The prince did not think of trying to stop it. All he could remember afterwards was that he seemed to have called out, "Parfen, I won't believe it!" Next moment something appeared to burst open before him. A wonderful inner light illuminated his soul. This lasted perhaps half a second, yet he distinctly remembered hearing the beginning of the wail, the strange, dreadful wail, which burst from his lips of its own accord, and which no effort of will on his part could suppress. Next moment he was absolutely unconscious. Black darkness blotted out everything. He had fallen in an epileptic fit. As is well known, these fits occur instantaneously. The face, especially the eyes, become terribly disfigured. Convulsions seize the limbs. A terrible cry breaks from the sufferer. A wail from which everything human seems to be blotted out, so that it is impossible to believe that the man who has just fallen is the same who emitted the dreadful cry. It seems more as though some other being inside the stricken one had cried. Many people have borne witness to this impression, and many cannot behold an epileptic fit without a feeling of mysterious terror and dread. Such a feeling, we must suppose, overtook Rogojin at this moment and saved the prince's life. Not knowing that it was a fit, and seeing his victim disappear head foremost into the darkness, hearing his head strike the stone steps below with a crash, Rogojin rushed downstairs, skirting the body, and flung himself headlong out of the hotel, like a raving madman. The prince's body slipped convulsively down the steps till it rested at the bottom. Very soon, in 5 minutes or so, he was discovered, and a crowd collected around him. A pool of blood on the steps near his head gave rise to grave fears. Was it a case of accident, or had there been a crime? It was, however, soon recognized as a case of epilepsy, and identification and proper measures for restoration followed one another, owing to a fortunate circumstance. Colia Ivolgin had come back to his hotel about 7 o'clock, owing to a sudden impulse which made him refuse to dine at the Epanchins', and finding a note from the prince awaiting him, had sped away to the latter's address. Arrived there, he ordered a cup of tea and sat sipping it in the coffee-room. While there, he heard excited whispers of someone just found at the bottom of the stairs in a fit, upon which he had hurried to the spot with a presentiment of evil, and at once recognized the prince. The sufferer was immediately taken to his room, and though he partially regained consciousness, he lay long in a semi-dazed condition. The doctor stated that there was no danger to be apprehended from the wound on the head, and as soon as the prince could understand what was going on around him, Colia hired a carriage and took him away to Lebedeff's. There he was received with much cordiality, and the departure to the country was hastened on his account. 3 days later they were all at Pavlovsk. End of Part 2, Chapter 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Part 2, Chapter 6 of The Idiot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Eva M. Martin. Part 2, Chapter 6. Lebedeff's country house was not large, but it was pretty and convenient, especially the part which was let to the prince. A row of orange and lemon trees and jasmines, planted in green tubs, stood on the fairly wide terrace. According to Lebedeff, these trees gave the house a most delightful aspect. Some were there when he bought it, and he was so charmed with the effect that he promptly added to their number. When the tubs containing these plants arrived at the villa and were set in their places, Lebedeff kept running into the street to enjoy the view of the house, and every time he did so, the rent to be demanded from the future tenant went up with a bound. This country villa pleased the prince very much in his state of physical and mental exhaustion. On the day that they had left for Pavlovsk, that is, the day after his attack, he appeared almost well, though in reality he felt very far from it. The faces of those around him for the last 3 days had made a pleasant impression. He was pleased to see not only Colia, who had become his inseparable companion, but Lebedeff himself and all the family, except the nephew who had left the house. He was also glad to receive a visit from General Ivolgin before leaving St. Petersburg. It was getting late when the party arrived at Pavlovsk, but several people called to see the prince and assembled in the veranda. Gania was the first to arrive. He had grown so pale and thin that the prince could hardly recognize him. Then came Varia and Ptitsin, who were rusticating in the neighbourhood. As to General Ivolgin, he scarcely budged from Lebedeff's house, and seemed to have moved to Pavlovsk with him. Lebedeff did his best to keep Ardalion Alexandrovitch by him, and to prevent him from invading the prince's quarters. He chatted with him confidentially, so that they might have been taken for old friends. During those 3 days the prince had noticed that they frequently held long conversations. He often heard their voices raised in argument on deep and learned subjects, which evidently pleased Lebedeff. He seemed as if he could not do without the general. But it was not only Ardalion Alexandrovitch whom Lebedeff kept out of the prince's way. Since they had come to the villa, he treated his own family the same. Upon the pretext that his tenant needed quiet, he kept him almost in isolation, and Muishkin protested in vain against this excess of zeal. Lebedeff stamped his feet at his daughters and drove them away if they attempted to join the prince on the terrace. Not even Vera was accepted. They will lose all respect if they are allowed to be so free and easy. Besides, it is not proper for them, he declared at last, in answer to a direct question from the prince. "Why on earth not?" asked the latter. "Really, you know, you are making yourself a nuisance by keeping guard over me like this. I get bored all by myself. I have told you so over and over again, and you get on my nerves more than ever by waving your hands and creeping in and out in the mysterious way you do." It was a fact that Lebedeff, though he was so anxious to keep everyone else from disturbing the patient, was continually in and out of the prince's room himself. He invariably began by opening the door a crack and peering in to see if the prince was there, or if he had escaped. Then he would creep softly up to the armchair, sometimes making Muishkin jump by his sudden appearance. He always asked if the patient wanted anything, and when the latter replied that he only wanted to be left in peace, he would turn away obediently and make for the door on tiptoe, with deprecatory gestures, to imply that he had only just looked in, that he would not speak a word, and would go away and not intrude again, which did not prevent him from reappearing in 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. Colia had free access to the prince, at which Lebedeff was quite disgusted and indignant. He would listen at the door for half an hour at a time while the two were talking. Colia found this out, and naturally told the prince of his discovery. "Do you think yourself my master, that you try to keep me under lock and key like this?" said the prince to Lebedeff. "In the country, at least, I intend to be free, and you may make up your mind that I mean to see whom I like, and go where I please." "Why, of course," replied the clerk, gesticulating with his hands. The prince looked him sternly up and down. "Well, Lukian Timofeyovitch, have you brought the little cupboard that you had at the head of your bed with you here?" "No, I left it where it was." "Impossible! It cannot be moved. You would have to pull the wall down, it is so firmly fixed." "Perhaps you have one like it here?" "I have one that is even better, much better. That is really why I bought this house." "Ah, what visitor did you turn away from my door about an hour ago?" The general. I would not let him in. There is no need for him to visit you, prince. I have the deepest esteem for him. He is a great man. You don't believe it? Well, you will see. And yet, most excellent prince, you had much better not receive him. May I ask why? And also, why you walk about on tiptoe, and always seem as if you were going to whisper a secret in my ear whenever you come near me? I am vile, vile, I know it, cried Lebedeff, beating his breast with a contrite air. But will not the general be too hospitable for you? Too hospitable? Yes. First he proposes to come and live in my house. Well and good. But he sticks at nothing. He immediately makes himself one of the family. We have talked over our respective relations several times, and discovered that we are connected by marriage. It seems also that you are a sort of nephew on his mother's side. He was explaining it to me again only yesterday. If you're his nephew, it follows that I must also be a relation of yours, most excellent prince. Never mind about that, it is only a foible. But just now he assured me that all his life, from the day he was made an ensign to the 11th of last June, he has entertained at least 200 guests at his table every day. Finally, he went so far as to say that they never rose from the table. They dined, supped, and had tea for 15 hours at a stretch. This went on for 30 years without a break. There was barely time to change the tablecloth. Directly one person left, another took his place. On feast days he entertained as many as 300 guests, and they numbered 700 on the 1000th anniversary of the foundation of the Russian Empire. It amounts to a passion with him. It makes one uneasy to hear of it. It is terrible to have to entertain people who do things on such a scale. That is why I wonder whether such a man is not too hospitable for you and me. But you seem to be on the best of terms with him. Quite fraternal. I look upon it as a joke. Let us be brothers-in-law, it is all the same to me. Rather an honour than not. But in spite of the 200 guests and the 1000th anniversary of the Russian Empire, I can see that he is a very remarkable man. I am quite sincere. You said just now that I always looked as if I was going to tell you a secret. You are right. I have a secret to tell you. A certain person has just let me know that she is very anxious for a secret interview with you. Why should it be secret? Not at all. I will call on her myself tomorrow. No, oh no, cried Lebedeff, waving his arms. If she is afraid, it is not for the reason you think. By the way, do you know that the monster comes every day to inquire after your health? You call him a monster so often that it makes me suspicious. You must have no suspicions, none whatever, said Lebedeff quickly. I only want you to know that the person in question is not afraid of him, but of something quite different. What on earth is she afraid of, then? Tell me plainly, without any more beating about the bush, said the prince, exasperated by the other's mysterious grimaces. Ah, that is the secret, said Lebedeff with a smile. Whose secret? Yours. You forbade me yourself to mention it before you, most excellent prince, murmured Lebedeff. Then, satisfied that he had worked up Muishkin's curiosity to the highest pitch, he added abruptly, "She is afraid of Aglaya Ivanovna." The prince frowned for a moment in silence, and then said suddenly, "Really, Lebedeff, I must leave your house. Where are Gavrila Ardalionovitch and the Ptitsins? Are they here? Have you chased them away too?" They are coming, and the general as well. I will open all the doors. I will call all my daughters, all of them, this very minute," said Lebedeff in a low voice, thoroughly frightened, and waving his hands as he ran from door to door. At that moment Colia appeared on the terrace. He announced that Lizaveta Prokofievna and her 3 daughters were close behind him. Moved by this news, Lebedeff hurried up to the prince. "Shall I call the Ptitsins and Gavrila Ardalionovitch? Shall I let the general in?" he asked. "Why not? Let in anyone who wants to see me. I assure you, Lebedeff, you have misunderstood my position from the very first. You have been wrong all along. I have not the slightest reason to hide myself from anyone," replied the prince gaily. Seeing him laugh, Lebedeff thought fit to laugh also, and though much agitated, his satisfaction was quite visible. Colia was right. The Epanchin ladies were only a few steps behind him. As they approached the terrace, other visitors appeared from Lebedeff's side of the house, the Ptitsins, Gania, and Ardalion Alexandrovitch. The Epanchins had only just heard of the prince's illness and of his presence in Pavlovsk from Colia, and up to this time had been in a state of considerable bewilderment about him. The general